If you believe that intelligence has no age and instinct has no dress code, like this video and subscribe. We tell stories about people who refuse to be dismissed, and this one is one of the most remarkable we have ever told. There is a particular kind of dismissal that is reserved for people who are not supposed to know things. Not the dismissal of a bad idea, or a weak argument, or an insufficient piece of evidence. Those are professional judgments, fair or unfair, made within the bounds of a process that at least acknowledges the person making the contribution. This is the other kind, the kind that doesn't engage with the content at all. The kind that looks at who is delivering the information and decides, before a single word has been evaluated, that the delivery cannot possibly be worth receiving. That was the dismissal that met 16-year-old Zora Clement on a Tuesday evening in March, when she walked into the front desk of the Harlan County Police Department with a manila folder, a typed summary, and 3 weeks of work she had done in her bedroom after school and on weekends, work that pointed, with a specificity she was prepared to explain in detail, to a concrete lead in a missing persons case that had been officially inactive for 2 months. The detective she spoke with was named Roy Catlett. He was 53 years old, 26 years on the force, and he listened to Zora for 4 minutes with the particular expression of a man performing patience as a courtesy to someone he has already decided is not worth his time. Then he told her it was a good effort. He told her missing persons cases were complicated. He told her to leave the folder if she wanted and they would look it over. He said it the way adults say things to teenagers when they want the teenager to leave. Zora left the folder. She left the building. She went home and sat at her desk and made a decision. If the police were not going to follow the lead, she was going to follow it herself. What she found, in the next 18 hours, using tools available to anyone with an internet connection and the patience to use them correctly, was not just a lead. It was the answer. And when it surfaced, Roy Catlett did not sleep that night. Zora Clement was 16 years old, the daughter of a librarian and a high school biology teacher, and she had grown up in a house where curiosity was treated as the most valuable trait a person could develop, more valuable than talent, more valuable than charm, because curiosity was the engine that made everything else run. Her mother, Patricia, ran the reference section of the Harlan County Public Library, with the focused competence of someone who has spent 20 years understanding that the most important skill in any research environment is knowing how to ask the right question. She had passed this to Zora not as a lesson but as a practice. From the time Zora could read, they had played games at dinner about sourcing, about verification, about the difference between what something said and what it meant. Her father, James, taught biology and coached the school's science Olympiad team. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had watched hundreds of students discover their own capabilities, that the gap between a person who could solve problems and a person who couldn't was almost never intelligence. It was methodology. It was the willingness to be systematic, to look at a problem and break it into the pieces that could be addressed before addressing the pieces that couldn't. Zora had absorbed both of them completely. She was a junior at Harlan County High School, where she was on the debate team, the science Olympiad team, and the school newspaper, the last of which was where the missing persons case had first come to her attention. In January, the paper's faculty advisor had suggested a student feature on community impact stories, and Zora had chosen to write about a woman named Delia Marchetti, a 44-year-old bookkeeper who had been reported missing by her sister 8 weeks earlier, whose case had generated a brief flurry of local coverage, and then, as these things often do, had disappeared from public attention without resolution. Zora had started with the news coverage. She had found 11 articles across 3 local outlets, read all of them completely, and built a timeline of what was publicly known. She had interviewed Delia's sister, Carmen, who was warm and exhausted and grateful that anyone was still paying attention. She had spoken to 2 neighbors and a coworker, and somewhere in the 3rd week of that research, in the accumulated weight of details that individually meant nothing, but together meant something she couldn't yet name, she had started to feel the specific sensation her mother had described to her once as the research instinct. The feeling that the information is telling you something your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. She had kept pulling threads. She had found it on a Tuesday evening. She had driven herself to the police station. She had her license 4 months, with a manila folder containing a 6-page typed summary, annotated with sources and timestamps, and a conclusion that she was prepared to walk through step by step with anyone willing to listen. Roy Catlett had not been willing to listen. The case of Delia Marchetti had been opened in January and downgraded to inactive status in February. The official position, as reported in the last news article Zora had found, was that there were no confirmed leads suggesting foul play and that adult missing persons cases frequently resolved without police involvement. The individual had sometimes simply chosen to leave their circumstances without informing people in their life. Zora had read that explanation. She had read it the way her mother had taught her to read official statements, not for what they said, but for what they assumed. And the assumption embedded in the inactive status was that Delia Marchetti had left voluntarily, which required ignoring several things that the reporting had mentioned and then not followed up on. The first was that Delia's car was still in her apartment parking lot. The second was that her phone had last pinged a cell tower 3 blocks from her workplace on the evening she disappeared, at a time when she would normally have been commuting home. The third was a detail in Carmen's interview that Zora had written down and stared at for 2 days before she understood why it mattered. Carmen had mentioned that in the weeks before Delia disappeared, her sister had been anxious about something at work. Not dramatically anxious. Carmen had described it as low-grade, persistent, the kind of worry that surfaces in small ways. She had mentioned it once in passing and then not brought it up again because Delia had told her it was nothing and Carmen had believed her. Zora had gone to the company where Delia worked as a bookkeeper, Harlan Commercial Realty, a mid-sized property management firm. She had not gone in person. She had done what any thorough researcher does first. She had mapped everything publicly available. The company's incorporation records, which in her state were searchable in a public database. The property filings associated with its registered name. The names of its officers, which were listed in the incorporation documents. And there, in a secondary filing from 3 years earlier, was a name she had seen somewhere else. She had gone back through her notes. She had found it, a name mentioned in a court filing from an unrelated civil case she had pulled while building background on the neighborhood where Delia's phone last pinged. The name appeared in both places, not in a way that was obviously significant. In a way that required 2 databases, 1 archived court document, and the patience to build a map of connections rather than look for a single smoking gun. The connection was between a property acquired by Harlan Commercial Realty 2 years ago, a warehouse on the industrial edge of town that the company had purchased and not developed, and a man named Gerald Sims, who appeared in the court filing as a party to a disputed transaction, and who was listed in the company's secondary filing as a silent partner in the property acquisition. Gerald Sims was not in Delia's case file. He had no public connection to her disappearance. But he had a connection to her employer, and the warehouse had no public development history, and Delia had been anxious about something at work in the weeks before she vanished. Zora had documented all of it. She had written it as a chain, source to finding to implication, each link cited, each assumption labeled as an assumption rather than a fact. She had done this because her mother had taught her that the difference between evidence and speculation was the honesty with which you labeled each one. She had brought it to Roy Catlett. He had looked at her for 4 minutes and told her it was a good effort. She had driven home. She had sat at her desk. And then she had made the decision that changed everything, not to stop, but to take the next step herself. Not to confront anyone, not to go anywhere physical, but to keep. Pulling the thread she had found and see how far it went before it either broke or led somewhere that even Roy Catlett could not ignore. She opened her laptop. She had 18 hours before school. The warehouse on the industrial edge of Harlan County had a property registration that was publicly searchable. Zora had already found that. What she had not yet done was search the registration against the county's utility records, also public, maintained in an online portal that most people did not know existed, built as a transparency measure years ago and rarely visited by anyone except contractors and researchers. She searched it at 9:47 p.m. The warehouse had active utility service. It had been drawing electrical power continuously for 4 months. Not a large draw, not the signature of heavy equipment or active construction. A small, steady draw. The kind consistent with climate control, lighting, and the basic systems required to make a space habitable. A warehouse that Harlan Commercial Realty had purchased and never publicly developed was drawing the utility load of an occupied space. Zora sat with that for a moment. Then she cross-referenced the utility account holder against the county's business license database. The account was held not in Harlan Commercial Realty's name, but in the name of a shell entity, 2 words, registered to a post office box, with an incorporation date of 11 months ago. The registered agent for that shell entity was Gerald Sims. She added this to her document. She sourced every step. Then she did something that was not investigation but journalism, which was, technically, what she had started this as. She called Carmen Marchetti. It was 10:23 p.m. Carmen answered on the second ring, the way people answer late calls when they have been waiting for months for a call that matters. Zora asked her one question. Had Delia ever mentioned a warehouse, or a property, or anything about a storage facility in connection with her work? Carmen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she mentioned once that she had found a discrepancy. In the property accounts, she said she was going to ask about it. She paused. That was 2 weeks before she disappeared. I didn't connect it. Zora wrote it down. She thanked Carmen. She said she would call her tomorrow. She compiled everything into a single document. 15 pages now. Every source linked or cited. Every assumption clearly distinguished from every verified fact. The chain from Delia's employer to the silent partner to the warehouse to the shell entity to the active utilities to Carmen's account of the discrepancy, each link documented, each gap honestly identified. She printed 2 copies. At 7:15 in the morning before school, she did not go back to Roy Catlett. She went to the Harlan County Sheriff's Office, a separate jurisdiction from the city police, and asked to speak with a supervisor. She was shown to the desk of a lieutenant named Sandra Ackafer, who was 41 years old and who looked at Zora with the direct, assessing attention of someone who has learned not to decide what she is looking at before she has looked. Zora placed the document on the desk. She said, I am a junior at Harlan County High School. I have been researching the Delia Marchetti missing persons case for 3 weeks as a school journalism project. I brought this information to the city police last night. I don't believe it was acted on. I am bringing it here because I believe it is specific enough to warrant a welfare check at this location. She pointed to the warehouse address, highlighted on the second page, and I believe that check is time-sensitive. Ackafer looked at Zora. She picked up the document. She read the first 3 pages without speaking. Then she looked up. She said, give me 20 minutes. She did not take 20 minutes. She took 11. When she came back, she had a second officer with her and a set of keys she had obtained through a request Zora was not party to. She said, stay here. They left. Zora sat in the chair beside Ackafer's desk with her second copy of the document in her lap. She sat for 43 minutes. Then Ackafer came back. Her expression was the careful, composed expression of a professional who has just encountered something significant and is managing both the professional and the human response to it simultaneously. She sat down across from Zora. She said, we found her. Delia Marchetti was alive. She had been held in the warehouse for 9 weeks, not physically harmed beyond the trauma of confinement and the medical effects of prolonged captivity, but held by Gerald Sims, who had discovered that Delia had found the financial discrepancy he had been concealing for 2 years inside the company's property accounts. A discrepancy that, when fully unraveled, pointed to a significant embezzlement scheme that he had been running through the shell entity and the warehouse property. He had panicked. He had made a decision that people who have been concealing things for years sometimes make when they feel the walls closing. The decision to contain the problem rather than face it, to buy time through an act that was catastrophically worse than the thing he was trying to hide. He was arrested at the warehouse that morning. Ackafer looked at Zora and said, this document, the utility records, the shell entity, the connection to the discrepancy, how did you find this? Zora said, public databases. Everything I used is cited in the footnotes. Ackafer looked at the document again. Then she looked at Zora with the expression of someone recalibrating several things at once. She said, how old are you? Zora said. 16. Ackafer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the detective at City Police who received this last night, did he give you a case number or a receipt for the document? Zora said. No. Ackafer said. I see. She said it in the particular tone of a person who now has 2 problems to address instead of 1. Delia Marchetti was transported to Harlan County Medical Center, treated, and released to her sister 4 days later. Carmen had driven to the hospital in the middle of the night and had not left until Delia was discharged. The reunion was private and stayed that way, which was exactly what both of them needed. Gerald Sims was charged with unlawful imprisonment, financial fraud, and related offenses. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The trial date was set for the following year. The embezzlement scheme he had been running through the shell entity was referred to the state's Financial Crimes Unit. The full scope of it, which Zora's document had only identified the edge of, took investigators 3 months to map completely. It was larger than the initial filing suggested. Roy Catlett resigned from the Harlan County Police Department 41 hours after Delia Marchetti was found. The department's official statement said the resignation was voluntary and cited personal reasons. What the statement did not address, and what a formal internal review opened at the request of the sheriff's office would eventually address at length, was the documented intake record showing that a 15-page document with sourced evidence had been received at the front desk at approximately 7:30 p.m. on the Tuesday evening before Delia Marchetti's rescue, and that no action had been taken on it in the intervening 12 hours. The review's findings were not made fully public, but several of their implications were. The department revised its intake procedures for tips and informal submissions. It established a formal acknowledgement requirement, a case number or reference issued to every person who submitted information, regardless of the department's initial assessment of that information's value. A training module on unconscious bias in witness and Teamster evaluation was added to the department's annual certification requirements. These were institutional changes. Small, procedural, the kind that don't make headlines but that matter in the accumulated weight of 1,000 future interactions. Lieutenant Acaffer submitted a commendation letter, through official channels, addressed to the Harlan County High School principal, recognizing Zora's research and her decision to bring the information to the sheriff's office when the initial intake did not result in action. The letter was specific about what Zora had done and how she had done it, because Acaffer believed that specificity was the difference between a commendation that meant something and one that was filed and forgotten. Zora's article was published in the school newspaper, a full account of the investigation, written with the same methodological honesty she had applied to the research itself. It named what she had found, how she had found it, and what had happened when she first tried to report it. It was the most careful piece of journalism the paper had published in its 12-year history, according to the faculty advisor who had been editing student work for most of that time. It was picked up by the regional newspaper, then by a state outlet, then by a national platform that covered emerging journalists. Zora did not enjoy the attention the way people expected her to. She accepted it as she accepted most things, with the composed, clear-eyed steadiness of someone for whom the external response to a piece of work is distinctly secondary to the work itself. She was asked in several interviews how it felt to have solved a case that the police had dismissed. She said, consistently and without drama, that she had not solved a case. She had compiled publicly available information into a coherent document and brought it to people with the authority to act on it. The people who solved the case were the officers who had acted. She said this not as false modesty but as precision, which was how she said most things. Her mother, when asked by a neighbor what it was like to have a daughter who had done what Zora had done, said, "It's like I've always known her. It's exactly who she has always been." Her father said less. He was a man who expressed things in actions more than words, but he did do one specific thing in the week after the story broke. He came to Zora's room on a Thursday evening, knocked on the open door the way he always did, and placed something on her desk. It was a new notebook, the kind she used for research. And tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note in his careful biology teacher print that said, "Methodology matters, you knew that. I just wanted to make sure you knew I knew you knew it." Zora read it twice. Then she put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered. She had a new story to start. She had already identified the question she wanted to ask. She had written it at the top of a fresh page, sourced it to the observation that had generated it, and made a list of the 3 public databases she would check first. She was 16 years old. She had already started. If this story reminded you that curiosity is a form of courage and preparation is a form of power, please like this video and subscribe. We bring you stories like this every week, because some people deserve to be seen and some truths deserve to be told. The next one is already waiting for you.